over 1 million acres of coastal marshes throughout the United States. 220,000 of them are right here in North Carolina. Hi and welcome to In Focus. I'm Rtdnac. While coastal marshes are very prominent along North Carolina shores today, they are at risk. And if we lose these marshes, we lose some important wildlife and vegetation. At the mouth of the Newport and North Rivers in eastern North Carolina sits the Rachel Carson Reserve. In it, you'll find one of the most important natural resources in North Carolina, a salt marsh.
So we are setting up mist nets for part of our study on salt marsh, seaside, and Nelson sparrows.
Salt marshes not only are important to wildlife, but equally important to humans, improving water quality and serving as a natural buffer from flooding.
If these species are being impacted by sea level rise, we are also being impacted by sea level rise. Elsie, you want to help me put this pole in the ground again?
Murray West is a PhD student at UNC Wilmington, concentrating on the bird population living in the salt marshes. She, like many other environmental advocates, is raising the red flag about North Carolina's disappearing salt marshes.
It's very frustrating to know that, this species is on the brink of extinction and it's our fault. I think that's what's the most frustrating part is they're going to go extinct because of anthropogenic changes such as climate change and sea level rise. It's our fault that they're going extinct. There's not really another reason other than humans. So I think that's why it's so frustrating is we could have done something about it and we just haven't done enough climate mitigation to help save species that are going to go extinct because of climate change.
We caught up with West and her colleagues while they were working on their bird research. They all agree saving the marshes and the species within them is crucial.
When terrible storms come hitting the coast, the marshes serve as a buffer from some of that wave action, from some flooding. They also filter water and numerous other things that people really rely on but take for granted. So by observing and protecting salt marsh sparrows and salt marsh sparrow habitat, we're also protecting things that are good for coastal communities.
But there are a lot of reasons why salt marshes are in trouble today. But two of the most prominent reasons are sea level rise caused by climate change and humans building close to the marshes, which doesn't allow them to move when the waters rise. West says if this trend continues, some of the species they are looking at today will soon become extinct.
They are marsh endemic specialists, so they only live in this tidal marsh ecosystem and they can't go other places. So they're not going up to this high vegetation area. This is their home, this is where they have to live, and they don't have the flexibility to go inland to forage or anything like that.
Marshes rise and fall along with the tides on a daily basis. The plants that live within them providing food for the marsh species and playing an important role in trapping carbon dioxide so that it doesn't damage our atmosphere. But ocean levels are rising beyond the daily tides, and that threatens the plant life and animal life.
With about 1 foot of sea level rise, you can see we start to lose some of this salt marsh.
There are scientists across the state studying how the marsh changes are happening and what it could mean.
You'll see there's very little pink in this area, and so that's showing basically the coastal squeeze effect where there's not space for salt marsh to migrate in this area, and so there isn't that opportunity to offset some of the marsh loss.
At Duke University, they are mapping where the marshes are today and how sea level rise will affect them in the future.
Unfortunately, some of the factors that are causing increased flooding, such as sea level rise, are also threatening the salt marshes themselves. So it has the potential to get into this, negative feedback cycle where we're having more flooding due to sea level rise, and we're also losing some of that protection of the salt marshes due to sea level rise as well.
Flooding and animal life are two very tangible effects of the marsh changes. But it might be what they currently stop from being in the air that has some of the biggest impact.
As the tide moves in, it brings more sediment with it. And the salt marsh vegetation traps that sediment and it actually adds it to the top of the salt marsh. And so that's one way that salt marshes are storing a lot of carbon because they can build up over time, and all of that sediment they're building up is containing carbon.
Over the next 30 years, They expect a 10-inch to 12-inch increase in sea level rise.
For West, she says her studies help to show the complexity of the muddy, heavily vegetated marshes, and that the way marshes are able to move throughout the day is vital to their survival.
They are not spread equally throughout the marsh landscape. And so they do have to have this kind of high and low vegetation structure to be able to spread out throughout the marsh to forage throughout the day and then come up into these higher vegetation areas to kind of roost and hang out.
West and her professor Rtdnac can both often be found in the rich habitats of our North Carolina coast. Like West, the animal species that live in marshes are most important to Danner's work. When we look at how the marshes could be changing, do you worry about the animals that live in it, that they wouldn't be able to, the marshes then would not be able to sustain those same animals?
Yeah, well, so a lot of the marsh species that we study are called tidal marsh endemic species, which means that they're endemic to, they only live in tidal marshes. So that's the habitat that they must have. So if you don't have that tidal marsh habitat, you're not going to have that species.
I think a lot of people would look out at this and not realize, it looks like overgrown vegetation.
Right.
They wouldn't realize the importance of what this is offering for, the biodiversity out here.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. What we're seeing here is really an incredibly rich ecosystem. Salt marshes are known to be very productive. There's tall vegetation. There are secretive birds moving down underneath it. There are large conspicuous birds we might see. There are diamondback terrapin turtles scuttling across the mud. So there's a lot of life out there that may not be visible until you get out into the marsh and become immersed in it.
We all hear the talk of climate change and how climate change can affect, especially the waters. What do we see it as far as affecting the marshes?
Recently, there was a report from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which highlighted the fact that we'll expect to see 10 inches to a foot of sea level rise on the coast of the United States in the next 30 years. So that's between 2020 and 2050. And if we were to see that 10 inches to 1 foot increase in sea level here, much of what we see here would be inundated constantly. And this vegetation can't survive if it's inundated constantly, so the vegetation would die off.
You can see where the feathers are starting to come in right here.
And for the young leaders in this field, they say while some aspect of salt marsh destruction might not be evident to the average person, it is advanced enough today that consequences are starting to be felt.
Their populations have been in major decline, about 9% a year from the 1990s. And so they're expected to go extinct by about mid-century. That should have an indication to us that something's going wrong and that sea level rise is really increasing at this rate, that these birds can't sustain themselves. We probably won't be able to sustain ourselves in this ecosystem for much longer either.
A deeper look at the struggles of the marshes and how geologists are studying their changes when we come back.
Here on Wrightsville Beach, there's a lot of urbanization and infrastructure, and if there's no ability for marshes and wetlands to migrate, then they will disappear because there is no place for them to go.
Welcome back. This week we're going in focus on salt marshes here in North Carolina and some of the threats that they're facing these days. Right now I'm joined by Dr. Joanne Hall. She's with the Department of Earth and Ocean Science at UNCW. Thank you so much for joining us. And Tracy Scrable, she's with the North Carolina Coastal Federation as a coastal scientist. Also, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Tracy, I'm going to start with you. What is our biggest threat when it comes to salt marshes here in North Carolina?
Well, I think what we're looking at is some pretty high probabilities that sea level rises are going to speed up, basically. We've known sea levels have been rising forever, but the rate at which they rise is a concern at this point. And with that comes concerns over whether the marshes have the ability to keep pace with that, or whether they will drown in place or become degraded with all of their important functions.
That actually was my next question. Do the marshes have the capability of withstanding deeper waters, or does that kill off the vegetation that's there?
Well, again, it's a matter of rate. Marshes move landward and seaward historically, but they do so very incrementally, and they do it by building up sediment so that the plants can move upward within their natural growing range and then landward. When you superimpose super high rates of water now on top of them, it is unlikely that they could keep pace as they are currently growing.
Dr. Hull, when we look at the salt marsh transformations, especially due to climate change, what is it doing to the vegetation? What are we seeing right now with these marshes?
Well, it's a dynamic system, and so what we're seeing now with the vegetation, some places are very dynamic and some places are very stable. And it's really a matter of investigating which places are dynamic and which places are more stable. As Tracy has mentioned, some places are able to keep pace with sea level rise, and some places are less stable and are eroding through time.
So talk to me about what's the ripple effect of this. You know, we can see if a plant is dying off, but that can affect other things also.
Well, that's true. As we've looked at through time with urbanization and infrastructure, the ripple effect can be a loss of wetlands. And if wetlands can't migrate landward, as Dr. Scrable has mentioned, the natural tendency for wetlands are to migrate landward. But as we have infrastructure, like here on Wrightsville Beach, there's a lot of urbanization and infrastructure. And if there's no ability for marshes and wetlands to migrate, then they will disappear because there is no place for them to go.
So Tracy, what do we do about the fact, I mean, where we're standing right now, we see this, a wall is built right here. So what do you do when these structures are in place?
Well, I think we have to pay very close attention to those areas that are not already hardened like this, and we do have a number of those areas. So number one, we have to monitor the local effects that we're seeing now as sea level rise is really starting to pick up in its rate. And so we have to let the science guide us. So we have to look at where we can move infrastructure, where we don't currently have infrastructure, and then make really mindful choices about where it goes. Same with where we build houses, and the same with where we spend our dollars for purchasing lands, doing restoration. We need to think about a 50 to 100 year time frame, not the decades time frame that we normally would use.
So, you know, so often when we talk about environmental changes, climate change, we talk about down the road, this is happening. How quickly are we actually seeing these changes happen now?
Oh, it's definitely on the decadal scale. Marshes move slowly. Just like people move, marshes move. And it's a decadal scale, but things are moving more quickly than they have in the past. We just have to be cognizant of these changes and be mindful and take steps, work together as organizations work together, universities work, Tracy and I work together, and the local governments all work together. And I think that's important that we plan accordingly and be cognizant of these changes.
Before I let you go, I wanted to ask you a little bit about how you do your studying of the marshes. You do this through GIS studies. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So I look at historical aerial photography and satellite imagery, and now using drone technology, we can gather a huge archive of imagery to study the rate of change of marshes. And we use that by measuring the distances that things have moved through time. And through that calculation, we can actually calculate down to the centimeter level of the rate of change through time. It's back from the 1940s through the present, and then predict the future extent.
I guess my question for you is this something that everybody should be doing something to help out? You know, there's going to be people watching that say, so is this something that it's going to be local government that has to do this, the scientists have to do this, or is this something the average person can do something to help?
I think where we are right now and the reality of what we're experiencing, it's an everybody. It is global, it is national, it is individual, from how we live our lives every day, what cars we drive, you know, just what we can do in our backyards. Local governments have a huge role to play because they are our representatives and keep us safe. And then globally, of course, we have to reduce the emissions. That is where we are right now, is can we reduce those emissions to actually offset what we are looking at as the most probable rates of sea level rise. And I'll just mention that the best guess we have is that along this coast, we expect to see a foot of sea level rise between now and 2050, and we've seen a foot in the last 100 years. And that's a middle of the road estimate. So that should spur us all into action at all levels.
I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us and giving us a little bit of insight on this. I'd like you to stay with us. When we come back, we're going to talk with 2 state lawmakers to get their thoughts about what's happening with the salt marshes here in North Carolina. Stay with us. Welcome back. This week we're going in focus on salt marshes here in North Carolina. There certainly is a concern about whether or not they could be disappearing or certainly becoming smaller in our state. And what is there that we can do about that? Joining me now is Senator Michael Lee. He's a Republican from here in New Hanover County. Thank you so much for joining us today. And you know, this is one of those issues that I'm not sure everybody thinks about every day, but this is a big issue for the coastal communities.
Yeah, it's a significant issue, and I think that this issue was recognized even years ago. There's something called the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan that was initiated by statute back in the mid-90s that really related to more coastal habitats and fisheries and economic development. But over time, we've realized that that is directly correlated to the habitats, and the habitats, in large part, at least in this area, revolve around our coastal marshlands, not just for wildlife, but also nutrient removal from the water so that we have a healthier ecosystem.
So, you know, for a long time, whenever that word of climate change would come up, it's something that there was just a disagreement about in general. But when we talk about things like the coastal health, coastal marshes, things like that, climate change definitely has something to do with what's affecting that.
Sure, sea level rise as it comes up is a concern, and with our coastal marshlands, it's kind of the perfect storm of a lot of different things. It's sea level rise, it's too much sediment sometimes, so you have compaction, so you have them going down as the sea level is rising. In other instances, we don't have enough sediment, because you have bulkheads and things like that that prevent the sediment from going into the water and helping to build up some of those marshlands. So sea level rise plays a big part of it, but there are other parts of it that we really need to be focused on and looking at as well.
So, you know, this leads to the question of what can be done. Are there policies that need to be put in place? Are there laws that need to be put in place?
Sure. I mean, the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan, although it started in the 90s, has been updated multiple times. It was recently updated last year, and it really has a lot of good strategies in it, some of which we're already doing to some degree, and some that we're not doing. But what we really need to be focused on is really, let's do some mapping and monitoring so that when we do implement some of these strategies that are in the plan, that we see what works and what doesn't work, and whether we need to do more in some areas and less in others. You know, the coastal marshlands aren't the same all over the state. The middle part of the state reacts differently to some strategies versus, you know, our area down here. So we really need to be monitoring, managing, and then determining what those best practices are.
That actually brings up a question that I have. So often, different areas of the state have these different environmental issues or those types of issues that you know, somebody out in the mountains isn't going to be dealing with this issue so much. Is this one of the ones that you kind of have to teach your colleagues about a little bit whenever you talk about policies?
It is, but a lot of times we try and create analogies to what they're dealing with in the western part of the state. I remember one senator from the western part of the state telling me, you know, Michael, we keep putting sand on the beaches and it keeps washing away. And so I said, I know, we keep clearing that snow off the roads and it keeps coming back.
And when we talk about these marshes, you know, a lot of the fish so much get their nutrients that they need from here. And then when we talk about our commercial fishing industries, even our recreational fishing industries, so important for the state. I mean, when you look at the business side of these marshes, that's a big part of this.
It is, and like I said, in the mid-90s, I think the Coastal Habitat Protection Plan really started because of the economy and the business of marine fisheries in eastern North Carolina. It's evolved because we know now that the environment obviously is the critical part of that habitat. And so when we talk about clean water, we talk about sediments, whether it's too much or not enough. We really think about it not just in the context of environmental stewardship, but also economic development for our coastal areas.
So often there's conversations about what should be being done in Raleigh at that level and what should be being done at the local level, and how much should you be telling them, this is what you should be doing for this. We look at something like this area right here, where all built up around this area. You see the urbanization around here, so the marshes can't necessarily move. But how much do you need to just have discussions with local leaders, and how much of this is, we actually have to have something written down on this?
It's actually from local all the way to federal. We can do some things on the state level, and we do, especially with respect to living shorelines, that the federal component sometimes prevents us on the state level from doing some things that we want to do. Obviously, the locals have that land use authority and control, and that stems from essentially the state through 160D and the statutes. And so we can work with the League of Municipalities and the County Commission Association to really talk about some of those issues, because we're really not talking about one particular area, we're talking about a state resource. If we're talking about the coastal marshland, if we're talking about our beaches, these are really state resources. And so we as a state need to be responsible in providing really effective tools to make sure that we continue with what we've had in the past.
We were talking before we went on camera, it's beautiful when you can't help but look out at the view whenever you're here on the coast and just smile, because it's beautiful down here. Do you worry about what will happen to this view if this isn't taken seriously?
I worry about the view, I worry about tourism, I worry about the marine fisheries, and so that's why when this most recent plan came out, the Habitat Protection Plan, we're really going to take a close look at it, and we're going to see what we can do on a state level to help with some of those strategies. Again, mapping and monitoring is going to be critical, because all this really has to be evidence-based, determining what's working in the different areas, what we may need to do more of, and what may not be working and that we'll do less of.
Certainly an interesting conversation. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity.
And I'd like to thank you for joining our conversation as we focus in on the big issues that are facing North Carolina. We'll see you back here next week for another edition of In Focus. Until then, have a great week.